The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind, the Tathagata. And of course, the most important part of that is that we realize that true mind, which is none other than our own mind, our face before our parents were born, who am I? Any number of breakthrough koans express the same experience. And to come to awakening transforms our life. All the way along the process to coming to awakening, we are doing deep work, essential work that makes coming to awakening possible. Coming to awakening is quite simple, but it's not easy. It involves opening to what is beyond, well, the kind of knowledge that we're assuming knowledge is. It's an opening beyond words, beyond any classes in any subject we've ever encountered, including philosophy or religion. It's about going deep within ourselves. And in a certain way, for many people, it means raising the lid on Pandora's box. And that is the challenging part of it. What is required to come to awakening is simply awareness and attention, along with a kind of perplexity that comes about when we have a sense that there is something beyond what our ordinary way of experiencing life expresses that is really important, and that we have known it a long time in the past, and that it's so vital to return to that understanding. And we can. That's what awakening is. And of course, awakening comes in various different sizes and depths. And that's why it's really important, all the work that's done before even the initial awakening. And I talk about initial awakening because, as Hakuin said himself, he had 19 major Kensho experiences. Kensho meaning seeing into the true nature of reality, and countless minor ones. This is our model. It was early in American Zen, this idea that, as Roshi Kepler felt when he went to Japan to train, he was going to go grab Kensho and run back to the United States. It's not that easy. And if we try to do it that way, it is not really what Kensho is meant to be, and it won't last, and it won't transform our life. I'd like to share a little bit of the early spring message from Harada Shodo Roshi, abbot of Sogenji, in his early message of teaching to his students. Training is about seeing that which cannot be seen. Training is about seeing that which cannot be seen. It cannot be expressed in words. There is a koan that has a poem attached to it that speaks of a mute trying to tell a dream. If someone has no words, someone is incapable of speech, and they've had this incredible dream, and they want to share it, but they have no words for it. It's quite like that. Flora Courtois, who I mentioned in the opening talk, spoke at one point of 2 visions that she had, which were not long before she had her very deep Kensho experience. And one of them was that she was working in a gray little office building at a gray desk, manipulating colored cubes. And without seeing them, she wrote that she understood that there were other people in similar offices in that building doing the same thing. And then one day, she turned around, and she hadn't realized before that moment that there was this great large window behind her, and it looked out on an amazing vista. And not only that, it was open and she could step through it. And so she did, and she found herself in this incredible scene, a meadow filled with flowers, butterflies flitting about, birds trilling, mountains in the distance, a river, a stream nearby, paradise. And it was so extraordinary that she wanted to share it with everyone else in that building. And as soon as she stepped back into her office from that scene, she suddenly realized she had no words that could express it. And there are no words that could express it. It was an extraordinary experience for her. And when we have an awakening experience, initially, it can feel like, well, of course it's like this. How could I have missed that? But then often with an initial kensho, we'll pop back into our old ways of experiencing, thinking, and so on. And we'll realize, oh my God, that was incredible. But all along the way, in the path of coming to awakening, which, as I said, requires attention, awareness, I would add courage to that as well, because most of us who come to practice come from a history of challenge in our lives. And we have dealt with those challenges the only way we really could have, which was to shut down any feelings we had around them and try to pretend that we exist as a part of society, as someone who is honored and cared about. And deep within ourselves, we have this hollow feeling that it's not true, maybe. And it involves opening to that and being curious about it, feeling the sensations that are buried deep within us that were shut down at those painful times. Because until they are allowed to come to consciousness, they drive our behavior behind the scenes. And to become free of them is simply amazing. And I'd like to share, with regard to that, something from a book that was recommended to me by a professor of quantum physics who lives in Sardinia and has connected with us. This was written by a man who invented, what did he invent? The microprocessor. He's an Italian by birth. He's in his 80s at this point. He was born in 1941. And in the one book that's translated in English is his autobiography. It's called Silicon, From the Invention of the Microprocessor to the New Science. And of course, it's off there next to the page here, so I can't read the whole title. But this man has some rather amazing things to say. And one of the things he said, he talked about having 4 lives. For the first time, I felt the sense of being responsible for my thoughts rather than being at their mercy. That's a very important thing to take in. He said, I was born to a new life every time a mental structure made of prejudices, obsolete teachings, and uncritically accepted beliefs was shattered, and I came out as if freed from prison. He continues, I was born to a new life every time my mind, observing from a new point of view, expanded to broader and different understandings. Above all, I was born to a new life when I stopped rationalizing and began listening to my intuition, opening myself to the mystery of my own consciousness. Opening myself to the mystery of my own consciousness. That really is a different way of expressing Zen practice. Let's continue with a little bit more from what Harada Roshi said. Again, training is about seeing that which cannot be seen. We do Zazen to become resilient. To see that which cannot be seen is not imagination. When our mind becomes deep and quiet, we can perceive the whole picture. That physical seeing will certainly have an end. We're all going to die. For that, we do not need to put our life on the line. He often speaks of putting our life on the line with regard to Zen practice, challenging our notions of who we are, who we think we are, who we assume we are, because that's not who we really are. As you heard from the scientist, when we let go our beliefs, our ideas about ourselves, our investment in attitudes, in assumptions, and so on, then we have a chance to see clearly the nature of reality. And intuition, true intuition, not imagination, but true intuition, has a big role in this, because we cannot come to awakening without intuition, without seeing beyond where we are caught in what we have been born into in terms of society's beliefs, assumptions, our family beliefs and assumptions, and the conclusions we've drawn about that, about ourselves. True freedom is to become free of those constraints. And as part of that process, we will no doubt encounter fear, because those constraints have built a nice set of seemingly safe structures around us that really are not safe, and they're not helpful. They're barriers to true experience. And true experience is what we're searching for, because that's real. The ideas, the assumptions we have about ourselves, that's a story built on history, on experiences, on our conclusions about those experiences, and it is not true. Perplexity is important in this search. And I think that naturally comes to us. We have it in childhood. We're curious about things. And then so often that curiosity gets flattened when we go to school. In the case of this scientist, it didn't. He maintained that curiosity, perhaps because his father was a philosophy professor, but it's hard to know. He found a fascination when one day he was 10 years old and he was out in a field playing with a friend, and suddenly there was this model airplane flying overhead, and he followed it all the way and decided it was so fascinating he would figure out how to make a model airplane. This one was one that you wound up with a rubber band, and it flew to a certain distance. And so his family was not particularly wealthy, and so he didn't have the money to buy one of the kits that was available, where you could actually have all the materials available and the instructions and make your own flying model airplane. So he tried different forms with different materials that he found around the house, and came up with this little model airplane, took it out in the field, and to his great disappointment, it didn't fly. So back to the old drawing board, as they say, and he tried again, and still no success. And this time, the man who had the model airplane that flew happened to be out in the field as well, and he looked at his invention and gave him some ideas about how he could make it so it would work. And so he went back, and this time he was able actually to make a model airplane that worked. And this persistence, trying again, not just giving up on the first chance, but trying again. This is essential in Zen practice as well. This is why one of the 3 pillars of Zen is dogged persistence is one way of expressing it. A persistence even in the face of assumed failure. And believe me, there is no such thing as failure in Zen. Even people who quit often will come back 5-10 years later with renewed commitment and make progress then, because they have that renewed commitment to Zen practice. And commitment is part of that package as well. We have the tools. This extended out breath is phenomenal. It is said to be what the Buddha was practicing when he came to his great awakening. The extended breath practice is the version taught in Rinzai Zen, and it is more effective than simply paying attention to the breath, although attention is important, really important. And normally when one starts with a breath practice, one starts with kind of anchoring it in a word on the out breath. For example, you would mentally count 1 on every out breath, or start counting 1 to 10 on every out breath, each one in succession. And then it comes a point where you don't need to count. Then what you want to do is immerse yourself in the experience, the bodily experience of that extended out breath. Now, for many people, it's difficult to breathe past a certain minimal amount. And that is a way we have held ourselves kind of on guard because of challenging experiences growing up. And the way to work with that is to tune in to how that feels in our body. It's kind of what we don't want to do. But as Roshi Kapleau used to say, the way in is the way out. Going into our bodily experience is the way out of suffering. Ajahn Chah, the forest master in Thailand, said that there are 2 kinds of suffering. There's the temporary suffering that you go through in your meditation practice as you begin to open to difficult places and have a chance to embrace them with radical acceptance, meaning you don't have to like it, but here it is. You may as well say, okay, here it is. And that is radical acceptance, by actually feeling that sensation in your body. And then there's long-term suffering, which is a suffering that takes place our whole life if we don't begin to work with this. The extended out breath is an incredible tool. Of course, there are also koans, and koans have their place as well. There are breakthrough koans. A koan literally means a public case, and they're all encounters between masters and students, or masters and masters in ancient times. And there are a few modern ones. For example, who am I? You know, we can look in the mirror and say, okay, I look like this, and this is my my history. This is how old I am. This is where I was born, and so on and so forth. But is that who you are? Harada Roshi has something to say about that. When our mind becomes deep and quiet, we can perceive this whole picture. That physical seeing will for certain have an end. For that we cannot, we do not need to put our life on the line. That physical seeing, that superficial seeing, that self-identity is going to have to be let go of. And if we're not willing to let go of it, which we can do through Zen practice, that's the challenge, it will be yanked out of our hands, so to speak, in the moments we die. When Shido Bunan, whose name literally means the Great Way is not difficult, that's his Buddhist name. He was the grandfather of the great Zen master Hakuin, who lived in 18th century Japan and was single-handedly changing Rinzai Zen practice back to its roots, reinvigorating it. When he was in Zen practice, actually, he started as a child. He was, I think he was the youngest in his family. He had an older brother, and it doesn't say anything about sisters, but I think there are other siblings, and I don't think they were boys. At any rate, when he was 10, 11 years old, his mother was a great adherent of a different sect of Buddhism, and she would take him to talks by a particularly bombastic priest who extolled the terrors of the different hells. Now, hell is in our own mind. And Jacques Lusseron put that into perspective when he had his profound awakening at Buchenwald, which was what anyone would call a hell realm. He became free right in the midst of that hell. Anyway, Hakuin was terrified. He was sure that being a young boy who did things like take his slingshots and knock out crows, and at one point he had his little bow and arrow set. And back then, all houses in Japan had literally paper walls. And he, of course, must have been told he couldn't shoot his little bow and arrow set inside the house, but he did anyway. And it went through a wall and pierced right through the eye of a figure in his brother's coveted scroll. So these kinds of things made him feel that he was destined for hell, and that the hells that had been described to him were not going to be fun. And so he begged his mother to tell him how he could avoid falling into hell. And his mother, being who she was and not a person really of practice, he was drawn to the teachings but didn't practice. And at the time, and still now in Japan, Shinto is a major religion. And so she told him he was born under the Shinto god, and I don't remember the name of the god, but at any rate, and that if he were to venerate that god, he would be free from hell. So he started learning the chants that were associated with that god, and practiced assiduously. He's a kid, and he's desperate to avoid hell. And finally, he begins to question whether that's really going to work or not. And so he lights a stick of incense and puts it in front of the altar and says to himself, okay, if the incense smoke goes straight up, it means I'm on target. If it doesn't, oh shit. And, well, it was an oh shit moment. He closed his eyes, opened them up, and the smoke was going straight up, and then a waft of air blew it out of straight up. And so that sank his hopes of ever avoiding hell by venerating the god he was born under. So then somehow he connected with Kannon, the bodhisattva of compassion, known as Kuan Yin in Chinese. And he actually went up on the hillside behind his house and found a rock that was shaped kind of like a Kannon statue. And he would go up there and sit on another rock and try to do zazen, even though he didn't know how to do zazen. And he would spend hours doing that, focusing on the compassion of Kuan Yin, which is something we could all benefit from. And you all experienced the guided meditation, metta meditation, loving kindness meditation, that is the mercy of Kuan Yin in words. And so when he was 13 years old, he begged his parents to let him become a Buddhist monk, because somehow he had this idea, and it came from another thing that his mother took him to. It was a play in which apparently historically there was a Zen priest that had angered the emperor and was condemned to having a red-hot iron pot placed on his head, tortured in that way. It's a kind of a unique kind of torture, but anyway. So in this play, this priest is standing there, and this supposedly red-hot iron pot is placed on his head, and he just stood there calmly. And so Hakuin took that to mean that if he became a Buddhist monk, he would escape hell. And so finally, after a year, his parents relented, and he was ordained by his uncle. There was a family temple that the family had supported, and he eventually became the priest of that temple many, many, many years later. But when he was ordained, he was first sent to a kind of a sect that did a lot of memorization of sutras, and then he decided to switch to Zen meditation. But when he was 19 years old, he heard a talk, and in the talk it was relayed that Ganto, who was a premier Chinese master who had come to awakening at a rather young age, but it was a very troubled time in China, and his temple, when he was teaching, he was in his early 50s, was overrun by bandits, and all the monks ran away, but he stayed, and they skewered him. And it is said that when he was run through with a sword, that he cried out so loudly that his cry was heard, his shout was heard 3 leagues away, which is 9 miles. And when Hakuin heard that, his heart sank. How could someone as eminent a priest as Ganto scream when he was killed? And so, disheartened, he actually left Zen practice for a while, apprenticed himself to a master calligrapher, and after about 8 months realized he was never going to make it as a calligrapher, which is ironic because he was prolific in his calligraphy and in his painting. There are many, many, many extant scrolls to this day. I cannot imagine what they cost now. At one time, they were not so expensive, but now I think they're quite expensive. And so he went back to, not exactly yet back to becoming a monk, but he went to a Zen temple where they were airing scrolls, which is done every year in Japan, twice a year, because Japan is such a damp country, and these scrolls rolled up get moldy. They have silverfish that live in them and eat the paper. And so every year they're rolled out in the sun on a sunny spring day or a sunny autumn day, before and after the rains, and aired, and then rolled back up with a kind of powder inside that discourages the insects from being in there. And so he said, okay, I'm going to just go up to the scroll. I'm going to put my finger on a passage, and I will look at it and see what it says, and that will guide me. Well, what he opened to was the story of a monk that's called Jimyo in Japanese, who was so determined to come to awakening that he held an awl at his side. Now, I don't know if you know what awls are, some of you may, but an awl is a very sharp instrument. It's used for making holes, far before they ever had drills. And so he would sit up late at night, and if he started to fall asleep, he'd stab himself in the thigh to wake himself up. And he ended up coming to awakening and eventually becoming a teacher. So inspired by this determination, Hakuin went back to practice. And the rest is history. It expresses the level of discouragement we can encounter as we do our practice, then the level of determination that's required, and the level of faith, really. Because faith that we can somehow do it. And that's not necessarily prevalent for many people. It certainly wasn't for me. You've heard this before, those of you who've been in Sesshin here before, but I was terrified when I was living at the Rochester Zen Center that people would realize that I did not have any faith. And I knew I didn't have great doubt, whatever that was supposed to be. Well, really, it's great perplexity if you look at what Stephen Batchelor wrote about it with regard to that term. Is this really all there is to life? I had a sense that there was something more. I've had that sense since I was a kid. And it's accurate. There is something more beyond our ordinary way of seeing. And this is what Harada Roshi was referring to. And particularly when he was saying that when our usual assumptions about ourselves are going to disappear with our death, our self-image is going to disappear when we die. But that which is beyond will never die because it was never born. And that is our original face. And that is who we really are. Actually, we're a combination because we have our persona, although we don't have to live the persona, we can live the original face and still function fine in society, freely, courageously, and with great positive effect. And that's why we do our Zen practice, is to realize that true nature of reality, that is who we really are. The rest of it is window dressing, although that's kind of a superficial way of expressing it. There's tremendous pain and suffering in humanity. And it's not to be taken lightly. But there is a way out if we're willing to walk through that challenge. And with guidance, we can do it. It takes time. And again, as I said at the very beginning, all the work we do before coming to awakening is vital. Provides a strong support for awakening when it takes place, and it also clears out a lot of clutter that would interfere with coming to awakening. So the most important thing is to persist, to have faith, whether you know it or not, and to persist, to be stubborn, to keep trying, keep reaching beyond, keep reaching beyond. I think that's enough for today, this first day of Sesshin. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.